Welcome to Love Your Job, Love Your Life podcast. I'm joined today by Daniel Dickson-Hope. And Daniel is a global chief people officer. And it's really interesting background, and like lots of chief people officers nowadays, but he's worked actually across a multitude of sectors. And probably most of them, if you call one out, he'd probably say, yep, done that one. So Daniel, it's great to have you on here because we've got a really interesting conversation today around culture and around executive teams. And your background and your wealth of experience is going to hopefully bring a lot of insights for people into this. And I know it's a massively challenging area for CPOs at the moment. So welcome to the podcast, Daniel.
And thank you very much for having me. Looking forward to it.
Great. So look, we're going to talk about kind of culture and how executive teams kind of almost set the precedence of culture in an organization. And through a couple of conversations we've had, we've always gone off on tangents, left, right, center, up, down, etc. So we'll try and keep it structured as much as we can today, Daniel. But I've worked in a number of organizations and some good, some bad, some indifferent. And when I personally reflect back on the good ones, the leadership team and the executive committee play such an important role in driving organizations forward. And in my last kind of corporate role as the global director of talent acquisition at Capita, I really saw that. Where you've got a joined up executive team, it makes a difference. So one of the first questions I've got for you, which is going to probably set the scene a little bit here for us, is executive teams can often get disconnected. So let me phrase the question this way: why is it so important that executive teams are really connected together as a team and really portray almost that right message down through an organization? Because if they get it wrong, that often can cause confusion. So why is it so important for them to do it, Daniel?
I think to start off, there's a really, really famous quote from Steve Greenert and Todd Whitaker. The culture of any organisation is shaped by the worst behaviour that leaders are willing to tolerate. And I think that's a good barometer to start with. But creating the right culture and a joined up approach, especially at exec level, top downwards as well as bottom up, is absolutely crucial for organisational success. For me, it's getting the balance right between performance, people, and purpose. Culture starts at the top. I think if your executive team set the tone for what is acceptable, what is to be celebrated and prioritised, then that enables the breeding of a more trusting culture to start with. Consistency helps with that. If all leaders reinforce, reflect, and role model the same values, behaviours, vision, employees will feel, hopefully, more secure, more empowered. They'll be clear on expectations. And I also think a unified approach in that aspect removes any silos, any internal politics, any miscommunication as well.
Yeah. And I guess, when we think about that, you often, and in larger organizations, sometimes this can be even harder than in small organizations, but in smaller organizations, you don't tend to get those silos quite so much. But in a large organization, those silos can really come in. And again, as you say, it's about setting that example. That's why it's important, setting that example from the top down to actually make sure that those silos you try not to keep those silos from forming and growing and building out from that. So when we start thinking about, and I know every organization is different, how do we kind of start building this culture of balance? Because I think that is also something that's really important. We've seen over the kind of last few years, and you probably had these conversations internally, exactly as I have with lots of clients I work with, around this, what is the best solution? What's the culture of the business from a hybrid return to office, work from home? All of these things play a massive part in culture. And people sometimes are scratching their heads a little bit, I think, Daniel, with how do you build a culture with a remote workforce. So how can executive teams start thinking about that and creating that culture of balance within the workplace, especially with so much talk around it at the moment?
For me, a balanced culture does drive sustainable results as well as engages both short term and long term thinking. But
Mm-hmm.
in order to get to that point, as you say, you've got to build the balance and be intentional about the culture that you create as well. And there's a lot to be said for alignment of vision and strategy. Also, lining that up with what the workforce want. I think from an employee engagement perspective, it's always great to have the thoughts, the voice, the opinions, and also the ambitions of your workforce known. And if you can document that, have it in writing, pulse surveys and similar, that's great. And then the speed and quality of execution of aligning all of these and enabling something quite quickly from a balance perspective, giving clear and consistent direction. That reduces friction and indecision. It enables your workforce to make decisions more confidently, act more quickly. And if you are going back to a point you made earlier with, maybe remote, hybrid, etc., if you move into a position along those lines, then the sooner employees know how you want to move to that point, the quicker they can embrace it and engage it. Leading by example, I think from an exec perspective is paramount. If execs can balance taking time off, setting boundaries, respecting flexible schedules, maybe refrain from sending late night emails, allowing people the right to disconnect, that type of approach,
Yeah.
it also helps signal that type of overworking isn't to be expected. Moving the position from burnout to balance, I think, is quite key.
Yeah. And there's a lot of that out there. I think I've done a number of podcasts where we always get into the conversation, the debate around burnout and well-being. And again, there doesn't seem to be a right or a wrong answer to that. But it's a massive problem because executives often, as you've highlighted, executives often work longer hours than others because they are the driving force often behind the business, and they are the ones with the neck on the line around business performance. Um, and they do shoot the emails out in the evenings, or they do things outside of normal working hours. Um, and often that can be difficult for an employee to kind of sit there in this wonderful world of technology where we've all got these little gadgets that are sitting next to us on the armchair of the sofa, and they go ping. And employees struggle to kind of go, actually, that's a work thing. I'm going to leave that to tomorrow. How do is there anything that you've done or you've witnessed to help improve that, or does this form kind of part of that culture in an organization to say it's okay to switch off?
Well, I think firstly, it is there to form part of the culture. You need to form part of the culture inclusive of that. But if I go back to examples of where I've worked with some of my exec teams previously, for example, we were sat in a room with one particular company, and they were discussing how to. It was a real high level conversation. How can we improve employee performance? How can we drive the
Yeah,
business measurables even further? And before it got into it, what can the employees do better? I spun the situation on its head and just looked at everybody in the room and said, what can you do differently? How can you move that needle? And that then led to me trying to drive a bit more of a larger discovery conversation around time management, how to lead by example, how to lead by example, but with purpose as well. And what can they do from an improving of culture and engagement perspective? And I've really, really quickly launched into, and this was back a few years ago when time blocking wasn't a thing. It wasn't a buzzword or a phrase to use, but I used to deliver it as what I would call, and you and I have discussed this previously, my 24-hour box model. And it is just effectively time blocking, but making people see that over the course of a day. And if I said to you, James, here's your box of 24 hours for tomorrow, how would you choose to use it? It starts to then resonate and make you reflect on not just what you do in your work life, but what you do in your home life. And the long and short of it with the exec team is moving them from, and I think I used this phrase earlier, from a point of burnout to balance, because we talk about how much time do you spend sleeping, how much time do you spend walking the dog? Do you plan your day before you come into work? Do you do it the night before? Can you get to the gym? Are you taking the kids to the cinema? Re-engaging people in what was normal life aside from exec responsibilities resets yourself internally, gives you a little bit more perspective from an employee position. And these people have all this to do outside of work, whether they're paid an exec salary or not, whether they've got exec role and responsibilities or not. Put yourself in the employee's shoes. And we worked through this exercise, and it suddenly moved people to a position of a little bit more clarity and understanding, a lot more empathy. But to my original point and the reason for flipping that conversation on its head, accountability and ownership. It isn't what can you do as an employee to make my business perform better? How can we lead you better? How can we guide you better? What environment culturally can we create? And taking a bit of a snapshot before and after that scenario, CEO would say to me, well, actually, my team are now reporting better sleep, improvements in relationships with their own friends and partners, higher work satisfaction, which then gives me a better performing exec team, which then leads to improved productivity across the workforce, higher job satisfaction, reduced turnover, better retention of clients. And then that even got down to macro level, no meeting Fridays, the old, no more people in a room for a meeting without an agenda. If an agenda doesn't fit, feel free to walk out, just being really stringent and really ruthless with what we now know to be quite owned, adaptable and well-known practices in the workplace. But a few years ago, me bringing this into teams that weren't too au fait with that and weren't keen on it initially, it just helped drive a bit of a better culture. And I've taken those experiences with me into different companies, worked with different exec teams, different chief execs. And I've also then just advised them on, if companies are not aligned and connected, what the impact of that is, even if it is just a case of reminding them that your employees could be demoralised or confused. You might have projects pulling in different directions. Reputationally, your outward and overtly projecting image in the public eye might not be what you'd hope it to be, whether that's Glassdoor, whether that's LinkedIn, whether it's on the news, dependent on the size of business. And just reminding people how much of an impact culture can have on every facet of both personal and professional life.
Yeah. And it's what you just talked about there is something that I talk about with Engage to Succeed an awful lot, because it is, and sometimes it's about that brutal honesty. It's about holding that mirror up to yourself and being brutally honest, saying, actually, where am I? And I always start whatever course I'm running with Engage to Succeed. I've got my model that helps hold that mirror up to people. But whether you're the CEO of a business or you've just left school and it's your first day in the workplace, holding that mirror up and saying, where are you on the model? Helps people to actually sit there and reflect and go, actually, I'm here. And then you say, well, why are you there? And often, one of the big things that I always hear, Daniel, is I wish I had more time to do more of what I loved outside of work. Whether that be, we were talking about running or walking just before we started this podcast. So whether it be running, whether it be walking, whether it be photography, reading, knitting, cooking, gardening, cycling, swimming, walking the dog, the kids, the family. I mean, there's 101 different things that people love. Unfortunately, we don't do enough of it. And you're so right in saying that actually by taking some time to do something that you love that is outside of work makes you more productive at work, because we all know that if you start a Monday morning having had a really great weekend, or and you've come into work and you're revitalized because you've done all these amazing things, your Monday is so much better than if you've had a weekend where something's gone wrong or something hasn't happened or you've had arguments or whatever it might be. You go into Monday morning with a completely different mindset. But we forget about it, and we forget about the impact it has on work, which is why I always say that history always says that you have this personal life here, you have work here, you have relationships here, you have societal things here, and you have to keep them all separate because they're all separate. But I think one of the great things that's happening in the world at the moment is that people are starting to recognize that actually they're all interlinked in one way, shape, or form. And it's about, as you say, it's about getting that balance, isn't it?
It is, and
finding that harmony.
And one other thing I'd probably tag on to everything that you've just said is, and this is typically how I finish my exec coaching sessions off with on this subject anyway, balance isn't just a feel-good HR concept, it's your strategic advantage.
Yeah.
And when you reframe it, or well, initially frame it or need to reframe it in that way, you can see the penny drop and people then will start to say, I know how to use this now, or I know how this will benefit X, Y, Z, whether that's company, team, individual, project, so on. And it's exactly right. It's exactly the same thing. Sometimes you've just got to reframe it for the individuals that you're speaking to.
Yeah. And balance for one isn't the same as balance for another as well, because that's the other big thing that comes out. We talked earlier about executives often, how many executives work 37 and a half hours a week? I'd love to find one that did. But they're not in that position because they love to work, but often you find that that's what drives them is work. So their balance between work and life could be 70 work, 30 personal, right? Whereas you take other people that might have the complete reverse of that, because actually life outside of work is so much more important, and the work is just a way to earn some cash to pay the bills. So they might not want to work full time. So their balance might be 30-70. And when you start getting that appreciation of actually what people's balance is and what brings them harmony in their life, then you can actually put your 24-hour clock around it and go, right, so yours, and I always use the 50-50 analogy of, because the math is simple. 8 hours of sleep. Here's my 24-hour clock for you, Daniel. 8 hours of sleep, 8 hours of work, 8 hours of personal life. 3, 8, 24.
Oh, yes.
I think that's correct.
And it's a lovely, lovely way to split and separate it out. And it's about getting people to a balance that well, essentially they're happy with.
Yeah. And that's what the working, if you look at what is a stereotypical day for most people, or what society says is a normal day, 8 hours of work, 8 hours of personalized, 8 hours of sleep. If you've got that perfect balance and that's what you're doing every day, that's probably the optimum for a lot of people. So look, we've talked about some stuff here, and you've talked about some of the work that you've done with executives and executive teams and executive coaching, which fascinates me, because you always find that there's one executive or maybe two executives on a board that maybe aren't quite aligned, or aren't quite on the same car journey or boat or whatever you want to call it. But in the work that you've done in this space, Daniel, with some of the businesses you've worked for, have you come across where you haven't had people aligned, and more importantly, what is the impact of that you've seen?
When people have presented resistance or challenge to this type of work that I've done with exec teams, it's typically because it doesn't appeal to them. They don't see the reasoning for change, don't understand how this can impact the greater good, whether that be the wider organisation themselves or everybody within the organisation as well as themselves. And it's just about really, really honing in on that and understanding the objections and not picking it apart in a way that is detrimental to anybody involved, but just purely to understand a bit further. And I always use that in a way whereby I need to make sure I understand my audience. And if there is, shall we say, a resistance to moving into a cultural change, driving against that resistance with empathy, understanding, but also aligning that with, well, the impacts to the organisation, the impacts to you and your team, the impacts to the individuals, and all these other little bits that I mentioned before: reputational risk, compliance, performance, efficiencies within the business, even taking that away from the execs and, concentrating more on your wider workforce, employee engagement scores, recruitment, retention, your EVP, which really should be the shop window for culture. When you're advertising an organisation, its brand and everything else that comes along with it, and working through it just as a senior leader level conversation. I haven't had a conversation like that hasn't resulted in someone deciding to stay put and not move over. But subsequently, I'd caveat that with, wasn't a 5 minute conversation either. Sometimes you've got to sit down once or twice and work it through. And I always like to benchmark the more difficult conversations against the result over a period of time, dependent on who, the scenario, what the period of time is and why, and all the metrics around that. But it's always good to use the metrics that link into that individual and their area of the business, whether that be quality, governance, finance, marketing, etc. I mean, for example, what I did with one commercial team was a skills, knowledge, and behaviour matrix. And it took that individual that owned that area of the business on a complete journey. And we had staff score themselves before, during, and after, and the results were remarkable. But that was just a real quick tool that wasn't a particular model, didn't belong to a thought leader that someone had grasped off LinkedIn and said, Daniel, can you, companyify this for me? It was about me sitting with people and understanding the challenges and thinking about how I could best move these people to where, as a business, we wanted to move them to make sure they're aligned with company goals, values, vision, behaviours, but also what the employees told us they wanted as part of that journey. And activities like that for me are really, really rich. I love being able to get people in a place where they're happy at work and they want to be the best that they can be, and we take them on that journey. And that could be employees with any scope of control at any level in the business. It just so happens that this was another exec team challenge.
Yeah, and sometimes and I'm just talking generally, or not we as in you and me. I'm talking hypothetically of we as in people. Sometimes we make snap decisions on people and we make judgment calls on people, don't we? And we sometimes we sit there and go, well, this person doesn't fit, or that person's not doing very well. And in actual fact, when you dig a little bit deeper, by the sounds of what you've just explained, is what you did. You actually get to the root issues of, it's very often it's not the right thing is not to let that poor person walk out of the business. Sometimes actually the best thing to do is to actually understand what's the root cause of why they're unhappy, and actually then address that if you can clearly address that. And probably 9 times out of 10 you can address it. And sometimes people, I've had examples in my career where I've had people work for me, performance has dropped, and you sit down and you have that conversation, and it's something that's going on at home, or they've been put into a role because are someone felt that was the right role for them. They accepted it, but in actual fact, it's not the right role for them, and they're just in the wrong role, but they love the business, and kind of it's that balancing act of making sure you ask those right questions, and as you've talked about, working with people around you to get the best out of the people that you've got in the business, because we all know the cost of fire and hire, rather than hire and fire, let's put it the other way around. The cost of fire and hire is significant. It costs a lot of money to hire somebody new to bring them in. So,
It does. It
very
does. And
interesting.
if you can hire those people and do your best to engage them, retain them, take them on that journey, you
Yeah,
improve your bottom line through people performance, productivity, lower absenteeism, improvement of their own personal health, whether that be physically, emotionally, mental health, fewer sick days, engagement scores, team cultures, everything is just improved tenfold.
yeah. No, brilliant. And look, as we think about kind of the future of work, Daniel. It's a big topic in itself, isn't it? The future of work. What is the future of work? As we think about the future of work, we've talked a lot about engagement. We've talked about a lot about the executive teams. We've talked a lot about actually the executives kind of help create that culture in the business, and what they set the scene, they set the tone, they set the path right for it. And a lot of culture, when organizations talk about culture, they talk about it from an organizational perspective, and they expect the leaders to do it. And to help the employees as individuals to engage with that culture and be part of that culture. Often, though, what I've seen is, and this is kind of going full circle right back to the beginning of the conversation, Daniel. Often, what I've seen though is that often we forget that, and whether it's do we forget or is it they don't realize, but often we forget that executives or senior leaders in a business are also individuals.
Yes.
So it's all well and good them talking about doing stuff, but when I've seen executive teams fail or toxic executive teams, the ship can be running along underneath them. But when you actually lift the bonnet up of the executive team, you don't see this joined up approach, and often executives don't talk about some of the stuff we've just been talking about. Is that something that you've seen, and how do you help the executive to realize that they are also individuals as part of the company culture? Does that make sense?
It does. It makes perfect sense. I think, firstly, it's about, well, in roles I've worked in previously, in roles I work in now, especially across the wider group of companies I'm with now, you need to have the right relationship with all your internal stakeholders, again, regardless of scope of control, level of responsibility. And the more you can understand those people, especially in my role as a chief people officer, people think a lot of it is about just purely the strategic element of a people plan, people strategy, people performance. But without the soft skills, without the relationship element, roles like mine are just very transactional. And the more you get to know someone or teams of people, the more you can influence what your strategies and your activity needs to look like. And it's having those one-on-ones. So, for example, in current business and previous businesses, MDs, CFOs, marketing directors, CTOs, whomever, I've got regular catch-ups in the diary with them all. Some a week. Well, frequency is irrelevant, but for the sake of this example, some are more often than others. And if there were people that I was struggling to engage with, or they were more resistant to challenge, or didn't understand, to your point, that they were also an individual in the organisation, I'd spend more time with them. And again, it's just about taking them on that journey and understanding what's good for them and why. So taking it all the way back to my 24-hour box model, what does their day look like? Home, work, life balance. What do they want to achieve? If people were to ask me that question, I'd want to achieve leaving a legacy that people would be, happy to adhere to, would understand that has brought benefit to the business and looked after them. But everyone's got their own reasons for getting out of bed in the morning and coming to work and going about the day. And it's about understanding all of that and helping then those individuals shape the day around that. And are they in it for the career? Is it a project for them? Are they goal driven? It's understanding all of these bits, but as well as understanding that, you've got to find a need to align that with vision, strategy, develop some trust and credibility with that person as well, if need be. And going back to talking about everybody as individuals, sometimes treat them as an employee as well and not as an executive peer. Remind them what's on offer to them in the workplace, because just because they are an executive member of this team, that team, or any other team, or they own and run a function, doesn't mean that they shouldn't know how to access benefits, what L&D is available to them. I mean, all these bits are different across different populations in the business, but the, not to coin a phrase used in a previous organisation, too far sat above the clouds not to be one of us. And I've heard that said before, and it's about removing those, perceived barriers. And once you can get people to that point, going back to what we talked about earlier, alignment, inclusiveness, culture fit, it just works. Again, it's like I said before, some people just take a little bit longer to move than others.
Yeah. And it's in itself, that is one of the massive, powerful elements of building a culture, right? That says, as a CEO or a CFO or a CTO or a CPO, whatever it might be, that you are openly almost showing that you are also an individual in the organization, and you are as almost as vulnerable as anybody else. And yes, you might set the strategy, and yes, you might be the leading force behind the business growth or whatever it might be, but you're still an individual. So helping people to almost understand that and then portray that, because that's often something that I talk about this all the time, but when I was in the corporate world, that's one of the things that I always struggle with, that I struggle to really know who our executive team were. In some cases, they would sit behind the big desk and they would be the corporate CEO or CFO, and that's fine if you're presenting to the city and you're trying to get your share price to go up. But
Yes.
actually, but when you're sitting in front of your employees, they actually want to see a human being. They wanted to see somebody that's genuine and authentic, right? So it's a really powerful thing. What you're doing with the businesses you've worked in is a really powerful thing, Daniel. So look, anyone that's been maybe listening to this that's a bit intrigued, I always like to finish podcasts, Daniel, with some hints and tips or closing remarks. If you this has now become kind of part of your tool bag, if you like, as a CPO, that you've taken to a number of businesses and had some fantastic results to prove that it works. What would your final closing remarks or hints or tips be to anyone that's listening to this, that's maybe thinking about culture and thinking about, we need to do something different, and as kind of what we've talked about, it resonates with? What would you say are the key things that you need to start looking at before you dive into it?
I think curiosity, whoever this point is for, curiosity is a fab piece of advice. Be curious and really start to get into the why. But if I was talking to leaders, I would ask them to think, what do I want the culture of my company to be? Consider legacy, as I mentioned about me personally earlier, because I think all leaders should want to be leaving a legacy. Reputation, I've touched on that internally and externally a few times in this conversation. Recruitment, retention, all the daily engagement. But more importantly, aim to take your people on that journey with you, whether it's the people you've got in the business now or the people that you want to attract to bring into the business. There's so many different facets that you can apply to that. As managers, I'd advise them to think about how they can contribute to the culture of the company that they work in. Can they contribute in the right way? Speak to their own leaders in the business, find out what's needed from them, and it's up to them then to decide if they're equipped to do this or do they need some further help and assistance. I mentor a lot of people in our business. I mentor a lot of people outside of the business through CIPD Trust and various other vehicles. And that's a big topic of conversation that I go through with people. Are they equipped to do that? That starts to lean into imposter syndrome, and that's a different conversation for another day. But for me, about being equipped is, do I understand what's required of me? Do I have the tools to do it? Am I confident to do that? And that's where the mentoring comes in. But lean on L&D, any other professional development that is available to you as well. I think that would be a real good piece of advice. And then for employees, if there's any employees of an organisation without any leadership or people management responsibilities, I'd say to them, have a think about what type of culture you want to be immersed in, involved with, working for. Is it the right environment? Do XYZ company treat the employees the way I would like to be treated? Not everybody just wants early finishes and pool tables. Different needs for different people, remote hybrid working, family focused policies, different leadership styles, organizational transparency. There's a real lot to think about. And I think when we talk about different populations and different responsibilities, there's different bits of advice and different conversations I'd have with each of those different individuals.
Yeah. No, that's good. And so right, everybody is different. So it's about figuring. It's coming back to that honest mirror, isn't it? Be brutally honest. And some people I've coached, where they've been, and this has happened to me, where they've been in an organization, the organization hasn't been the right organization for them. And culturally, there's a misalignment culturally. And when there's a misalignment culturally, often you're never going to be successful because you're never going to buy into that culture. So sometimes you have to move, but not all the time. And I think the other thing that I would say is, culture is such a big topic, and maybe there's a follow-on podcast here, Daniel. When is the right time to change the culture?
Yes.
Because I've worked in businesses where you look at the values and the culture of the business, and you look around and you're looking at people going, this doesn't feel right. And the reason it doesn't feel right was because the culture and the values of the business was created 10 years ago. And in those 10 years, they've had 3 CEOs and
Also,
3 CFOs and 3 CTOs and 3 CPOs. So when you go through change, and I'm not saying that you change the culture and the values every time a new executive team comes in, but if there is a big shuffle at an executive team level, that is usually a great time to reassess. Do the culture and the values of this organization still ring true? And for some organizations that are people focused, where they're, pharmaceutical businesses, where they're trying to save lives, etc., it often is still the same. But in people organizations, actually business services, it can change dramatically. So my tip and is always to say, is what we've got today fit for purpose? And again, that's holding the mirror up at the organization, saying, does this culture and values serve us for the next 5 years?
and I think future proofing is definitely a separate conversation, and one maybe for, as you say, another podcast at a later date.
Yeah, great. Daniel, this has been interesting. Nearly 40 minutes has passed. It goes in a blink sometimes.
It does, it absolutely does.
But Daniel, it's been great talking to you about this. The culture is something that is so important for organisations to get right. And actually, I don't think it's reviewed as much as it should be. And I think there probably lies a bit of a problem when organisations are getting a bit lost. I'm doing some work with a search firm at the moment where we're talking about the 3-year plan and the 3-year business plan, and that actually is saying, where are we looking to go? Where do we want to go? And do we need to review that culture and values piece to help drive that forward? And the answer to that question is yes, because it's not the same as it was 10 years ago. And I think actually that's where organizations need to step back a little bit and really do that. But Daniel, it's been great fun talking to you. Thank you for joining me. And I'm going to just say, I'm guessing that if anyone wants to pick up with you from a coaching perspective, from a a business perspective, from a whatever it might be, cultural, pick your brains on culture and values, or your 24-hour box tool. What's the best way to get hold of you? Is it through LinkedIn, or is there another way?
More than happy for people to reach out on LinkedIn. It's not a problem. I'm always on LinkedIn, and I find it a really, really useful tool, as I'm sure many other people do.
Absolutely. So what I will do, if anyone's listening and wants to get in contact with Daniel, in the description in the podcast description below, I'll put Daniel's LinkedIn link in there, so you can just click through and connect with him. Daniel, thanks again for joining. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for having me,
building
James.
culture.
Brilliant.
No problem.
Have a great day. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot.